sometimes their lives, to be the best, and to avoid the dishonor of defeat. The athletes competed naked and were idolized not least for their godlike perfection of form. Their fearlessness and nerve in contests bordered on the suicidal. They competed in boxing matches of gruesome ferocity and chariot races in which few made it to the finish. For the ancient Olympians, winning was everything. Theirs were not polite and gentlemanly contests or exercises in amateur sportsmanship. The first Olympians fought for tangible rewards. Officially, winners received the symbolic olive crown, but when they returned home as conquering heroes, they were given extravagant prizes. They competed seriously and fiercely for a kind of immortality. There was no afterlife in the Greek religion, and it was only through the fame and glory that one could hope to live on, remembered in sculpture and song. To lose was devastating. There was no silver and bronze in the ancient games. The losers went back to their mothers without delight, creeping through narrow alleys, wrote Pindar, poet of the ancient games. Little remains of ancient Olympia to bring to life the festivals that took place here. These pillars once held a majestic shrine to Zeus, in whose honor the games were held. This simple field was the stadion, where the track events were held, the grassy slopes teeming with 45,000 Greeks. This tunnel once echoed with the footfalls of Olympians entering the field. Overlooking all, a winged Nike, goddess of victory, was the symbol and spirit of the Olympic Games. The origins of Olympia are almost prehistoric. Humans lived here in 2800 BC. Around 1000 BC, Olympia became a shrine to Zeus, god of thunder and lightning. The games evolved from religious rites. The first contest was a foot race to the altar of Zeus, a ritual sacrifice of energy to the god. The first recorded games took place in 776 BC. They continued every 4 years without a single interruption for the next 12 centuries. The games were held in August under a full moon. Athletes had to arrive 30 days early for a month of training and scrutiny by the Olympic judges called the Helena Decai. If you've practiced hard for Olympia, and if you've not been lazy or done anything dishonorable, they told the athletes, then go forward with confidence. But if any of you have not trained yourselves this way, then leave us and go where you choose. For the games, Olympia would fill with visitors, 100,000 people from all ends of the ancient world camped in the fields and olive groves around the shrine. They came by sea and by land. They came from as far away as Egypt, from other parts of Africa, from Marseille in what today is France, and from Obbia on the southern coast of what would become Russia. Often they came from city-states at war with each other. The Greeks were notoriously quarrelsome. But such was the importance of the games that a truce of Zeus inscribed on a sacred discus and lasting 3 months protected all travelers to the shrine. Perhaps because it was enforced by the fearsome Spartans, the truce was seldom violated, and the most bitter enemies were able to meet and compete at Olympia in peace. The first day of the Olympics was a day of religious purification. The athletes were brought here to the Bouleuterion, the home of the priests. This rock once held a statue of Zeus with his thunderbolt in hand. Under the stern gaze of the god, as the priests sacrificed the genitals of a bull, the Olympians took an oath, the solemn oath of Zeus, to compete fairly and obey the rules. It was an intimidating moment. The penalties for foul play were severe. The statues in this row were called the Zanes, put up by disgraced athletes who tried to bribe their way to victory. Not with money, but with speed of foot and strength of body must prizes be won at Olympia, the inscriptions read. The crown sometimes came at a bloody price. First, we'll explore boxing and other deadly sports of the ancient world. The beauty and art of sport, but they were also shamelessly fascinated with the savagery and violence of competition.
The Greek word for contest is agon. Our word agony comes from that. The notion of the agon is really central to Greek culture, but particularly in athletics, where agony meant the contest itself contained pain and strife and suffering.
No sport contains more agony than boxing, which has deep roots in ancient Greece. This elegant fresco of two young boxers was painted nearly 1,000 years before the Olympics began. Boxing was added to the Olympics in 688 BC, followed by wrestling and a vicious new form of fighting called pankration. These three events were favorites with the crowd, and because of the risk and occasional sacrifice of life, were considered especially pleasing to Zeus. The fights were held in the most sacred part of Olympia, before a 30-foot altar to Zeus made entirely from the ashes of sacrificed animals. A modern boxer would be horrified by the lack of ground rules that governed an ancient boxing match. There were no weight divisions, there were no rounds. The boxers fought without a break, without water, without a corner, and without gloves.
They wound leather straps of rawhide leather around their fists and up their arms in order to increase the violence of the blow itself. The leather would actually cut into the skin of the opponent. They would very often land a blow in the head, and there would be blood dripping all over. And they would fight on and on.
When the Romans governed the Olympics, beginning in 146 BC, the boxers inserted inch-long metal spikes between the straps.
So it was almost more like a knife fight than a boxing match. There were very short careers, and there were either people who were very successful and then a lot of newcomers who kept getting stabbed or actually ruptured by these gloves.
The fights were held in August in the afternoon under the blazing Mediterranean sun, so that the boxers had to fight glare, dehydration, and sunstroke along with each other. Fights lasted for hours until one boxer signaled defeat, which he did by raising a single finger. But the shame of defeat was so great that many fighters took a vow to die in the ring rather than lose. Mamalos of Alexandria died here while boxing. His funeral plaque reads, "He prayed to Zeus to give him either crown or death." The Spartans, fanatically militant and trained never to quit, would not compete in the boxing ring because the disgrace of surrender was so crushing. Fighters were admired not just for the punishment they could inflict, but for the pain they could endure. One boxer, Eurydimus of Cyrene, swallowed his teeth rather than show his opponent they were broken.
They really valued philosophically and physically this notion that you could endure pain to such an extent that you would go on and on receiving blows and enduring the sun and the dust and the heat. And there were philosophical virtues behind it.
If a fight dragged on indefinitely in a stalemate of pure stamina and will, the judges would call for a climax in which the fighters traded undefended blows.
There is one famous story about two fellows who came to this point in the match, Croesus and Demosthenes. It was a face-off, and they had one blow each. The first blow was to be landed by Demosthenes, and instead of a fist, he used a karate jab and pierced, supposedly, the skin of the opponent, and reached in, gripped his entrails, and tore out his intestines. Croesus, the poor deceased, posthumously was declared victor because of a technicality. They claimed that Demosthenes had not given one blow, but 5, because he used all 5 finger points to pierce his opponent.
The ancient fighters did not have sophisticated training equipment, but they still had physiques as impressive as their modern counterparts. Boulders like this one, weighing 316 pounds, were the bodybuilding tools. A weightlifter in the 6th century named Bibon lifted this rock over his head with one hand, so the inscription declares. Boxing may have appeared to lack ground rules, but the Pancration was worse.
The Pancration was an original and very brutal event. It was the most brutal of all the ancient competitions. And some people say it was imperfect boxing combined with imperfect wrestling. You could throw punches, you could kick, you could strangle, you could break bones. Absolutely nothing was barred.
Introduced in 648 BC, the Pancration was governed by only 2 rules: no biting and no gouging. Even those were not always enforced. Conducted in the nude, blows to the genitals were frowned upon, but the rule was frequently ignored. Technique was beside the point in this ancient version of an alley fight.
Pancration, which personifies the violence of ancient sports, was the most appealing, the most popular of all events. And that may tell us something about the human spirit through the ages.
The only relatively civilized combat sport by today's standards was wrestling, although here too the rules were very relaxed.
Generally speaking, it was everything goes, and a lot of things that aren't allowed today. Again, types of strangulation, occasionally breaking bones would be allowed, and tripping was also a good technique.
Highly trained, the ancient wrestlers were well schooled in a vast number of moves: the flying mare, the hammerlock, and various body holds. The matches were held in a pit, and there were 2 forms of competition: upright or on the ground. Upright, the wrestlers maneuvered around each other on their feet. 3 throws of any kind meant defeat. Ground wrestling was a messy affair, held in a mud pit that made the fighters slippery and difficult to hold. The match continued as with boxing and Pancration until one wrestler signaled defeat. Wrestling too was violent. As early as the 7th century BC, the judges felt the need to make a rule against finger breaking. It was largely ignored. In the 5th century BC, Leontiscos of Sicily won 2 wrestling crowns in a row by breaking the fingers of all his opponents. Wrestlers and other fighters weren't the only ones risking life and limb at the ancient Olympic Games. The chariot races were the ultimate in recklessness and wreckage. The Olympic Games were at their peak around 500 BC. At that time, most of Europe was occupied by a marauding race of warrior tribes called the Celts. Rome was still in its infancy. India was about to be transformed by the teachings of Buddha. Long before the Olympics, there's evidence that the Greeks liked to mix danger with sport. Bull jumping was a popular event in Crete 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. Contestants literally grabbed the horns of a charging bull and somersaulted over its back. During the Olympics, the most dangerous sport was the chariot race. Deep beneath this wild olive grove lie the remains of the Hippodrome, the chariot racing track at Olympia. It was swept away when the Alpheus River suddenly changed course around 600 AD. The track was 150 yards long and had room for 44 chariots, each one pulled by 4 horses. Along the sides and on either end sat tens of thousands of spectators. The race was a test of skill and nerve, 24 laps with over 160 horses stampeding up and down.
The most difficult point in the course is when they would come to the turning post. That meant that you had to pivot the chariot 180 degrees in absolutely no distance. And literally, the chariot itself would spin around the corner. Naturally, there were lots of wrecks at the corners. Chariots turning over, guys flying out, horses tripping over each other.
Adding to the danger was the fact that there were no lane dividers. Head-on collisions were frequent. According to the poet Pindar, in one race, 43 of the 44 chariots crashed. The winner was the only one to survive the field. Zeus ruled Olympia, but for the charioteers there was another god of great importance, the god of horses, whose statue overlooked the track.
His name was Taraxippus. He was the horse disturber. So naturally, you'd give lots of offerings to Taraxippus before you would start your chariot race.
The one point of order came at the start. The Greeks devised an ingenious mechanism that guaranteed fairness out of the gate. It featured a bronze eagle of Zeus that rose above the crowd and triggered the race. The chariots themselves were small two-wheelers, open at the back, with 4 spokes to a wheel. The drivers stood. This statue of a charioteer holding the reins was found at Delphi, where the Greeks competed in games almost as prestigious as the Olympics. The Greeks prized poise and control in the midst of violence and chaos, and this figure captures that ideal. Women were not allowed to compete as charioteers, but they could enter teams of horses they'd train. This pedestal once held the statue of a victorious princess from Sparta.
Kings of Sparta were my fathers and brothers. Cainista, victorious at chariot races with her swift-footed horses, erected this statue. I assert that I am the only woman in all Greece who won this crown.
Boys were often used as jockeys in the horse races that followed the charioteers. Again, the drama of the race was the tension between wildness and control. The jockeys rode bareback with neither saddle nor reins, guiding their steeds with their knees and goading them with whips. The horses were wild. In 512 BC, a mare named Breeze threw her jockey as she bolted out of the gate, ran the race riderless, and won. People came to see and be seen. Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato were all here, mingling with the throng. Herodotus, the world's first professional historian, made his reputation here, reading his work from the back of the Temple of Zeus. People also came for the art that embellished this legendary shrine. These pedestals once supported thousands of works of art, a forest of statues, in the words of one writer. Only a handful have survived, masterpieces pulled from the rubble a century ago. Sadly, nothing remains of the legendary statue of Zeus housed in the Temple of Zeus and once counted among the 7 wonders of the world.
An enormous amount of gold and ivory went into the making of this statue. All of the flesh parts were of ivory. The throne was partly ivory, partly ebony, partly jewels. All of Zeus's drapery was of gold, gold leaf. It was amazing.
Surrounding the statue and decorating the inner temple were dozens of lion's head spouts. Across the top of the temple, sculptures portrayed scenes from Greek mythology. Adding to the dazzle of the shrine, many of the buildings were painted with brilliant colors and intricate designs. This ruin, surrounded by 182 pillars, was the Leonidium, an elite hotel for the very rich. Of the 100,000 visitors, only 50 were housed here at a time. The Olympians practiced here in the Palestra, where they boxed and wrestled, and in the gymnasium, where they trained for the most prestigious event of the ancient games, the pentathlon. If the chariots showed the Greeks at their most fearless, the pentathlon represented the other side of the Olympic ideal: balance, grace, and all-round skill.
The event had a certain idealism to it. The Greeks were concerned with proportion and balance in the individual. And I think we see this in the athlete who emerges from the pentathlon.
It was pentathletes whom the ancient sculptors used for models when they chiseled the bodies of gods. The Greeks valued proportion immensely, and the winner of the pentathlon was considered the greatest athlete of the games. He competed in 5 very different and stylistically demanding events: running, jumping, discus, javelin, and wrestling. Technique and timing were crucial to them all. The pentathletes spent years in the gymnasium training rhythmically to the accompaniment of a flute. The events differ from today's in interesting ways. In the javelin, for example, the Greeks used a loop in the middle of the spear to put extra thrust into their throw. They threw a heavier discus that weighed 15 pounds, 3 times the modern weight. Perhaps that's why they perfected a twist and release technique that survived to this day. The most dramatic difference was in the long jump, where the Greeks carried weights, 5 to 15 pound hand weights called halteres, which they used to add momentum and distance to their jumps.
It seems absurd to carry weights when you're trying to jump farther, but in fact, you can use the impetus of actually throwing the weights to literally pull you through the air, and you can feel yourself being dragged forward by the inertia of these weights. It really does add length to your jump.
The jumping pit in which the Olympians competed allowed for 50-foot jumps, more than the modern world record. All the athletes, including the pentathletes at the Olympics, competed naked. began to be held naked sometime in the 8th century BC. According to one story, in 720, a runner named Ossipus lost his loincloth in mid-race. When he won the race, all the runners decided to run naked, and the practice eventually spread to the other events. Modern scholars dismiss this explanation. Nudity and homosexuality were neither shameful nor uncommon in Greek society. The very word gymnasium, where Greek citizens were educated, means in the nude.
In the 600s BC, gymnasia were invented, the buildings of exercise. And also at this time, homosexuality became very important and out of the closet, as it were, for the Greeks. And at that point, nudity was also introduced into the games. There is no inherent connection, but it's my thesis that these things all contributed to one another in Greek society.
Homosexuality was not shunned at all in ancient Greece, and in fact it was encouraged because the important thing for a man to do was marry a virgin and produce children. The only way to keep virgins was the practice of homosexuality, and so it was encouraged. I think the atmosphere at Olympia must have been extremely electric. These men were the best of their city-states. They were the most handsome, they were the best trained, and there was also sexual attraction between them.
Married women were strictly forbidden from watching the games or even crossing the Alpheus River that bordered the sanctuary. The penalty for breaking this rule was death. Women caught in the sanctuary were thrown off a cliff that overlooked the shrine. Only young girls who were virgins were allowed to watch the games, despite the nudity and the brutality of the combat sports.
Unmarried girls, that is maidens, were allowed in because they were still in some sense wild. And also they had to get used to the idea of men being a part of their life. And what better introduction than to show them men performing completely naked.
One modern commentator said that it was because married women should not see what they don't have, and young virgins should look at the cream of the crop, the best Greek men that there were, because this is what they want to aim for.
The virgins had their own games in honor of Hera, wife of Zeus. It consisted of 3 sprints, one each for girls, teenagers, and young women. The track was shortened by a 6th to match the shorter stride of the girls. Spartan girls, trained athletically from birth like boys, dominated the games. Unlike the men, the women did not compete in the nude, but wore a short tunic called a chiton that exposed the right breast.
The women's events were a ritual activity, a kind of public demonstration of their value and their spirit before they were tamed in marriage, before they would become women. It was a rite of passage.
The women's races were held on a day of rest for the men. It was a day of ritual and feasting that brought to a climax the religious side of the ancient games. The altars to Zeus once stood here, between the temple of Zeus and the temple of Hera, in the most sacred spot in Olympia and site of daily animal sacrifice. The cone-shaped altar was famous throughout the Greek world. More than 30 feet high, it had been built up over centuries from the ashes of millions of sacrificed animals.
It would be a visual representation of the high honor in which Zeus was held. The more sacrifices he has, the more honor he has. And here, standing in front of you, is a visual reminder of how many sacrifices have been awarded to this deity.
Mixed with water and hardened into shape, a stairway was cut into the side of the ashy mound so that priests could make new burnt offerings. At noon on the third day of the games, the sacrifice was spectacular. A herd of bulls, 100 in all, was killed and burned in honor of Zeus. Actually, only a small and symbolic piece of each animal was offered to the god.
They'd take some of the most useless parts of the animal, and they would put them on the altar, and they would burn those for the gods. 99% of the animal then was butchered and cooked. And then in the evening, everyone would get a piece. The meat would be distributed to the crowd, and it would be a great occasion.
The next morning, the men's foot races began. As the first and at one time the only Olympic category, the races had special meaning for the Greeks. Each Olympiad was named after the winner of the stayed race, or single-length sprint. The stadion track looked much as it does today. The starting line has grooves which the runners could grip with their toes. The distance to the finish line was 600 feet, the length Hercules, the mythical founder of the games, covered in a single breath. On the slopes to either side, there was room for 45,000 spectators, many of whom camped and cooked on the grass during the night. They watched bareheaded in the August sun. Wearing a hat was forbidden in the stadion because it might obstruct someone's view. Seats or benches were never built into the sides of the hill in the manner of other stadions. The only seats were these 12-stone thrones in the center for the judges. And this single seat opposite, reserved for the only married woman allowed in the stadion, the priestess of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, who was once worshipped at Olympia before Zeus. As many as 20 runners could compete on the stadion track. They drew positions by lot, and a herald called them to their posts one at a time. Clean starts were strictly enforced. Runners who jumped early were beaten by the judges with rods. In the 4th century BC, the Greeks invented a starting mechanism called the hisplex, which used a bar in front of the runners to guarantee a fair race. One of the most striking differences between the ancient runners and modern Olympians was their starting stance.
The stance for the beginning of the race looks very odd to us, but you have to understand the setup and the mechanism. When the bar dropped, his arms would go down, his body would go forward, his toes would push out of the grooves, and he would get pretty good purchase for a head start into the stadium.
There's no way of knowing how fast the Greeks ran. They wouldn't have kept time even if they'd had stopwatches. They never measured any of their events or competed against a record. For the Greeks, the essence and meaning of sport were in the man-to-man duel, the agon or agony of a contest. Legends of speed do, however, abound. Vladas of Sparta either jumped or flew over the stadion. His speed was phenomenal and impossible to relate. In addition to the one-length stayed race, the Greeks also ran the double stayed, up and down the track, and the Dolokos, a 2¼ mile run 20 times around the track. The famous relay race in which they passed the torch was not part of the Olympic Games, neither was the marathon, although the Greeks relied on running as a form of communication and were phenomenal distance runners. Immediately after winning the Dolokos in 328 BC, a runner named Aegis ran from Olympia to his home in Argos, a distance of 60 miles, in a single day. The last race of the Games was most unusual, an exhausting test of speed and strength in which Greek foot soldiers twice raced up and down the track in full armor.
If you can imagine running with 50 pounds of armor for 400 meters at top speed and making a turn, it was a tremendous event. The interesting thing about the hoplite race is that it comes at the very end of the Olympic Games. It signaled the end of the Olympic peace interval and the return to hostilities, which were the sad fact of most Greek life. It was a reminder that all the beauty of the Games was about to end and a different kind of excitement was about to overtake their lives.
For 1200 years, the greatest athletes of the ancient world came to Olympia to compete in games that were a supreme test of power and grace. The winners received nothing more than an olive branch cut from a tree behind the temple of Zeus. But when they returned home, they were showered with money and gifts. They were worshipped as heroes and even gods. Olympians personified the Greek ideal of oriteia, of striving towards excellence. Even their sweat, symbol of that striving, was revered.
The sweat of the athlete was actually a very prized commodity. They would scrape the sweat combined with the dust of their competition, and they would preserve it and put it in bottles, and it would be sold as a magical potion.
This stone preserves the names of Olympian winners. Unfortunately, no statues remain of the true legends of the game, like Milo of Croton, a wrestler who won 6 consecutive Olympic crowns. He was so feared in his prime that once all his competitors dropped out of the games and conceded defeat, beaten by his reputation. His strength was said to be superhuman. Ancient sources report that Milo once carried a full-grown bull around the stadium and then butchered it and ate it in a single day. Another Olympian known for incredible strength was Polydamas of Scotus, a pancrationist who won in 408 BC. He was just as famous for his feats outside the games. Polydamas was said to have fought and killed a full-grown lion with his bare hands and stopped a speeding chariot by grabbing the rear with one hand. Among runners, the most successful was Leonidas of Rhodes. He won 3 races in each of 4 consecutive Olympiads and was literally worshipped as a god in Rhodes. But the single most astonishing Olympic feat, if it's to be believed, belongs to a jumper named Phailis, who competed in the 110th Olympiad.
According to the ancient stories, the jumping pit itself was a length of 50 feet. This is incredible to us because the modern jump is just a few inches over 29 feet, and Phailis is said to have jumped beyond the jumping pit, something like 55 feet, and landed with such force that he broke both of his legs.
The remarkable history of Olympia is reflected in this monument, the Philippion. It was built by King Philip of Macedonia and his son Alexander the Great after they defeated the Greeks in 338 BC. They built this memorial in the heart of Olympia as a show of power. The Romans did likewise 2 centuries later, placing 21 gold shields around the top of the Temple of Zeus after turning Greece into a Roman province. Olympia was now a show of Roman greatness, and Rome did much to renovate and maintain the shrine, building an aqueduct that carried water 10 kilometers to this once elegant reservoir. They also built a bathhouse and a club for athletes, excavated by German archaeologists recently.
The members must be winners in the Olympic events. And this is the building for the winners in the Olympic events. All this was had marble plaques on the floor. Even the walls were ornamented with marble plaques, and this basin, water basin, you can see some rest of the marble plaques. We have evidence by ancient sources that such guilds existed. And the most important, the winners in Olympia. It was the upper class athlete guild.
The building was constructed by Nero, who believed he was a god and competed in the chariot races in 67 AD. Driving a chariot drawn by 10 horses, Nero was thrown from the cart and couldn't finish the race. Nevertheless, he was declared winner. When Nero died a year later, his victory was overturned. Until recently, it was believed that the last Olympiad was held in 393 AD, when Theodosius I, the Christian emperor of Rome, ordered the close of all pagan shrines. 30 years later, his son Theodotus II supposedly finished the job, burning the shrine and the temple of Zeus in 426 AD. But Professor Sin and his colleagues have uncovered evidence that the games continued for another century, until 500 AD. They found their evidence on a plaque that had fallen into the bottom of an ancient latrine.
At the bottom of this toilet channel, we found one piece of this large plaque. It was written in different manners by 14 athletes. All of them are Olympic winners. The latest one in the very, very end of the 4th century AD. So we learn by this inscription that the history of Olympia is to be added by 120 years.
The ancient games finally stopped when 2 earthquakes destroyed Olympia at the start of the 5th century. A small Christian village eventually sprang up around the ruins, and its inhabitants built a church out of the only surviving building, the workshop of the great sculptor Phidias, where the legendary statue of Zeus had been carved. By the 6th century, it too had vanished, buried by floods that put all of ancient Olympia under 20 feet of mud. And that's where it remained for the next 1,300 years. The first excavation occurred in 1829. German archaeologists took over in 1875 and have been unearthing ruins ever since. The work is expensive. The stadion was not dug out until the 1960s, and the hippodrome, buried beneath these groves, will probably never be salvaged. As the ancient ruins were being excavated, the Olympic Games were revived. The first modern games took place in 1896. Every 4 years, the Olympic flame, which burned here for 1,200 years, is carried by runners to the site of the next games. But the modern games, for all their splendor, will never capture the wildness of the past.
Ancient Mysteries investigates the secrets in the stars tomorrow at 6. Stay with us for one of the most beloved comedians, Mary Tyler Moore, on Biography.
the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
The year that saw the handover of Hong Kong also marked the 50th anniversary of the end of British colonial rule in India. Mahatma Gandhi was the protagonist of one of the greatest events of the century, commemorating Indian independence.